Setting up for Facebook Live. Don't tell me this isn't going to work.
The screen says meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
Done. Redirecting to Facebook. Righto, over to you, Warwick. Your meeting.
Good. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this special meeting for the Aviation Historical Society. I'm from Queensland tonight. We've got people from New South Wales, Victoria, and even at least one Tasmanian I saw. And welcome all.
And one from overseas.
Okay. And that is?
Justin Taylor, our speaker for June.
Yes, and I'll be mentioning him shortly. Last meeting we had on the 24th of April, Peter Dunn told us all about the history of Brisbane's Eagle Farm Airport. And we had at least 48 people join us on the Zoom meeting there. That was recorded, and Peter put it up on Facebook. It's already 1,300 views on Facebook of the history of Eagle Farm Airport. And our speaker tonight, we've got Daniel Leahy. We're talking about 2 archaeology projects he's been involved in, which are one, the investigation of the wreck of an American Brewster Buffalo aircraft that crashed in northeast Victoria in July 1942. And secondly, he'll be talking about examination of airfields used by schools of the Empire Air Training Scheme and the similar training facilities for British Commonwealth Air Force personnel around the world. The next ordinary AHSA meeting, ordinary in its date only because it'll be a Zoom one too, will be on Friday 29th of May, another Zoom meeting. And this is going to be presented, the main speaker will be a Melbourne member, Phil Weber, excuse me if I haven't got the pronunciation correct, who will be talking about solving Circe, the 72-year-old mystery of a lost flying boat. Then later, Victoria, our colleagues in Victoria are going to have a Zoom meeting in the middle of June, the 11th of June, and they're changing the date of their meeting, which is usually at the end of the month, so it doesn't clash too close to the same time as our Queensland meeting. And so it's going to be 11th of June, and that will be, oh, please remind me of the topic will be for the Victorian people.
Robert, can you sort of tell us a little bit about that talk, please?
Thanks, Peter and Warwick. Yes, the evening is Thursday, the 11th of June, and we'll commence with a few words about local matters, of course. This will then be followed with my introduction of the guest speaker, Dr. Ellen K. Stoddart, and she is speaking on behalf of her son. The topic is flying high in Patagonia, and basically covers her son's involvement in the Perlin 2 project. It's all about record altitude glider flights. The mission statement is to reach the edge of space and study how giant stratospheric mountain waves help create the ozone hole and the impact on global climate models. Perlin 2 aims to reach 90,000 feet as a glider. Provide education and inspiration for young people as well, of course. Currently, they've reached 76,000 feet, so there's still a little bit of challenge left to get to 90.
Oh.
And that's about it. And they've got the picture on. Fantastic looking glider. That's it for me, Warwick.
It's an Airbus glider.
It is an Airbus machine.
An Airbus glider. That's great. All photographs of Zoom, and I gather it's a pressurised cabin there, which you certainly need for those altitudes. And the next month meeting from HSA Queensland will be Justin Taylor about Pacific Rex, as Peter's just put up there. So we hope we'll have you joining us at those meetings as well. Often at our meetings we chat about what's happening in the world of aviation. One thing I'll just mention is that the Australian International Air Show at Avalon has been postponed from February to November next year. The actual date's in November to be advised. However, with that, I think we'll now go to our main part of the evening, and we'll hand over to Daniel Leahy. I'll be quiet. Thank you.
And thanks, Peter. I'll share this screen again. That's it. Alrighty, so good evening, everyone. Some weeks ago, Peter asked if I'd be willing to talk to you all about some of my experiences with aviation archaeology over the past few years. I asked Peter if it was possible to organise such a presentation for one night this week, as it's actually National Archaeology Week, during which we aim to raise public awareness of archaeology in Australia and the work of Australian archaeologists around the world. Some of what I'll be covering this evening has already been presented at various conferences in recent years, so I apologise in advance to those who may have already caught some of my previous presentations. This presentation will probably also be quite a bit shorter than what you might normally be used to, but at the same time, that leaves plenty of time for questions afterwards. For those who don't already know me, I've been interested in Second World War aviation for over 20 years. And in that time, I've visited numerous aircraft wrecks and aviation infrastructure sites, such as airfields, headquarter buildings, radar stations, etc., in Australia, Papua New Guinea, the United States, and Canada. Between 2015 and 2017, I studied a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in both archaeology and history at the University of New England in Armidale, New South Wales. In 2018, I conducted an honours project investigating the archaeology of airfields used by schools of the Empire Air Training Scheme. And in March 2019, I started my current PhD project looking at the archaeology of Second World War air power sites in Australia. The aircraft wreck on the right of this slide is located near Gona in Oro Province, Papua New Guinea. Previously, it was incorrectly described as a Beaufighter and even a Wirraway. After this brief investigation that we did in 2006, where the engines and the undercarriage and other artefacts were located, it was determined to be a Douglas Boston, most probably one of those from number 22 Squadron RAAF, which exploded over the target after its bombs struck the fuselage. So in this presentation, I hope to first define a few terms and run through the general history of aviation archaeology before presenting two cases I've been involved with over the past few years. The first of these cases involves the investigation of the wreck of an American Brewster Buffalo aircraft, which crashed in northeast Victoria in July 1942. The second looks at one main aspect of my honours project, which compared a number of airfields utilised by the schools of the Empire Air Training Scheme and the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan in Canada, and similar training sites for British aircrew around the world during the Second World War. So first, what do we mean by archaeology? The Oxford Dictionary has defined the term as the study of human history and prehistory through the excavation of sites and the analysis of artefacts and other physical remains. It should be noted, however, that not all archaeology involves excavation. In fact, neither of the cases that I'm about to discuss involved any digging at all. It should also be noted that that archaeology does not simply mean the collection of artefacts for museum, display, private collection, whatever. For the purposes of this presentation, when I refer to history or historical record, I'm referring to the written documentation, including official records, history books, witness testimony, that sort of thing. And by archaeology or archaeological record, I'm specifically referring to the physical material remains, such as aircraft wreckage, built structures, human-made features in the landscape, such as runways, landing grounds, etc. Therefore, aviation archaeology can be defined as the study of human flight in the atmosphere through the investigation of material remains associated with the act of flying. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, enthusiastic amateurs began excavating aircraft crash sites in Britain as a way of collecting souvenirs from the wartime period. As this activity gained momentum, one of the earliest volumes dedicated to what was at the time loosely referred to as aviation archaeology was first written by Robertson and published in 1977 as a collector's guide to aeronautical relics. The second edition, which is pictured on the right, some years later, a television program documenting the recovery of human remains from the Second World War aircraft wrecks in the Netherlands referred to such sites as archaeological treasures. And discussed some archaeological methodologies, including ways to determine the earliest possible date of the crash, known as the terminus post quem, based on associated artifacts such as the dates on ammunition. However, the first mention in an academic journal of archaeological methodologies being used on a Second World War aviation site was made in 1981, when the use of side-scan sonar to locate the wreck of a Vickers Wellington bomber in Loch Ness was briefly discussed. It should also be mentioned that aviation archaeology is not limited to military aviation. That's just the sites that I'm interested in. During the 1980s and early 1990s, it was recognized by some that this expanding field of aviation archaeology needed to be less about simple acquisition and more about inquisition. As such, I've included the historical background associated with the two case studies, as well as questions raised from that which fueled the archaeological investigations. So, on to the first case study for this evening, the Brewster Buffalo wreck on Mount Stanley in Victoria. The Brewster Buffalo was an American-made single-engine, single-seat fighter aircraft. The prototype first flew in December 1939 and entered service with the United States Navy in June 1941. The type first saw combat with the Finnish military against the Soviet Union during the Continuation War of 1941 to 1944. Other operators of the aircraft type included both the United States Marine Corps, with whom the aircraft formed the bulk of the defence of Midway Island in June 1942. The type was also used by the British Commonwealth squadrons under the control of the RAF in Malaya and Singapore, and by the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army Air Force in the defence of the Dutch East Indies. Of the 509 Buffaloes produced, 92 were intended for the Dutch. After the surrender of Java in March 1942, 21 of these Buffaloes that were en route to the Dutch East Indies were instead delivered to Australia. This included one older model, serial B3119, seen here in an advertisement, which had remained in the United States for propaganda purposes. The remaining 20 aircraft were the final iteration of the Buffalo type, the model 339-23, and were acquired by the United States Army Air Forces in Australia. 17 of these ultimately saw limited service with units of the Royal Australian Air Force, including with number 1 Photographic Reconnaissance Unit and numbers 24, 25 and 85 squadrons. The aircraft in question was one of the 3 later model aircraft that were not delivered to the RAAF. While being operated by the US military, it crashed in the at the southern end of Mount Stanley, north of Myrtleford in northeast Victoria, at approximately 10:45 on the morning of 1 July 1942, during a flight between Laverton, west of Melbourne, and Wagga Wagga in New South Wales. Mr. G.D. Wood, a farmer at Bawidgie Creek, south of Mount Stanley, described the incident. I was standing outside of my home when I heard a plane pass over my house. I could not see the plane at the time. Rain was falling and it appeared to be above the clouds and flying in the direction of Mount Stanley. I noticed that the engine of the plane was not running smoothly, and I thought that the pilot was endeavouring to find a place to land. Shortly after passing over my house, the noise of the plane increased, and a few seconds later I heard a very loud crash. I was looking in the direction of Mount Stanley when the crash occurred, and I saw a dense cloud of black smoke rise from the mountainside in heavily timbered, rugged country. Later that morning, First Constable William John Miller at the Myrtleford Police Station received a phone call from the Bawidgie Creek Post Office informing him of the aircraft crash. Constable Miller located the site that day, describing the wreck as that of an American single-seater army plane scattered over a large area. 70 yards down the mountainside from the engine of the plane, I found the remains of the pilot. Parts of American flying equipment, including part of a parachute, were lying close by. Almost everything had been destroyed by fire. The pilot's remains were recovered from the site and taken to the Myrtleford Police Station that day. The pilot was 23-year-old Second Lieutenant Henry Orris Null, Jr. from California. Second Lieutenant Null was a member of the American 4th Air Depot Group that was based at Wagga at the time and had a detachment at Laverton. The unit's role was to assemble, modify, overhaul, and carry out major repairs on aircraft. On 18 April 1942, Henry Null's family received a cablegram simply stating, "Safe and well in Australia." This may have been the last his family ever heard from Henry. After the crash, Henry's body was buried at the Springvale Cemetery in Melbourne before being reinterred at the Rookwood Cemetery in Sydney later in the war. Henry's brother, Robert, also served with the United States Army Air Forces in the Pacific Theatre during World War II. On 16 April 1943, he was the navigator on board a B-24 Liberator that crashed in New Guinea, killing all 10 crew members. The brothers now lay side by side at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii. The identity of the aircraft that crashed has not yet been located in any sort of historical record. It is known that the 20 Model 339-23 Buffaloes would have each had from 3 to 5 identities. These include the constructor's number, assigned by the Brewster factory, the American civil registration used for flight tests at the factory, and the serial number assigned by the MLKNIL, or the Dutch Air Force, or Dutch East Indies Air Force, rather. 14 of these aircraft also received US Army Air Force's tail numbers while in Australia, and the 17 that were delivered to the RAAF were assigned RAAF serials with the A51 prefix. The image on the right is the status card for the aircraft that served with the RAAF as A51-8, and shows that it had been assigned Dutch serial B3-181 and US Army Air Force's tail number 302 prior to being received by the RAAF. The tail numbers applied by the US Army Air Forces were not formal serial numbers, but a form of identification used on the Buffaloes that had been requisitioned by the Americans in Australia. It should be noted that the first 6 Buffaloes that were delivered to the RAAF in June 1942 had not been assigned such tail numbers, while the second lot delivered to the RAAF in August 1942 had such tail numbers assigned. The Mount Stanley Buffalo crashed between these 2 deliveries, so it's possible that may not have been assigned such a tail number. That being said, Rick Hanning from the Gippsland Armed Forces Museum at Sale advised me in December that he had previously contacted the Aviodrome in the Netherlands, where some artefacts from the Mount Stanley wreck have been exported, who advised that those artefacts suggested the Mount Stanley buffalo had been painted with tail number 304. This information is now shown on Peter Dunn's Australia at War website. The two photos on the slide show buffaloes in Australia in American markings. On the left, the sole model 339D to arrive in Australia, B3119 with tail number 3119. And on the right is model 339-23, one of those 20, with tail number 313. Note that it also includes the late war star and bar insignia, indicating the photograph was taken in late 1943 at the very earliest. By determining the identities of the 17 buffaloes that were delivered to the RAAF, it has been possible to get a short list of potential identities for the aircraft that crashed on Mount Stanley. This table summarises the research presented on the ADF Serials website and highlights the 3 buffaloes that were not delivered to the RAAF based on that research. Note that tail numbers 301 to 312 are shown, with tail number 304 missing. With this information and the photograph on the previous slide, we can say that tail numbers 301 to 313 were definitely assigned. If the Mount Stanley buffalo did actually receive such a tail number, then 314 would have also been assigned at some point to an unknown buffalo retained by the US Army Air Forces. When we started looking into this case, a Dutch aviation historian, Peter Boer, suggested that some of the identities in the research presented by Peter Boer suggested that some of the information presented on the ADF Serials website may not have been correct, and that if the aircraft that crashed on Mount Stanley was tail number 304, it probably wasn't one of those 3 that ADF Serials had actually kind of alluded to. That being said, while preparing this presentation, I thought it best to recheck Peter Boer's work, and in early 2020, he has made updates to his documentation suggesting that what was probably tail number 304 did align with those buffaloes which did not see service with the RAAF as per the ADF Serials research, which is summarised here. This is just one example showing that the records regarding air warfare in Australia and the Southwest Pacific during early 1942, or our interpretations of them, are often incomplete or contradictory. It was hoped that investigation of surviving material remains would shed some light on this aircraft's true identity if a data plate or painted serial number was to be located. It was hoped that we'd be able to locate artefacts that included original paint, whether that be exterior camouflage, interior paint, or markings specific to the aircraft's identity or service. The aircraft is believed to have been painted at least twice, first in Dutch markings at the Brewster factory with the triangular national insignia, and later in American markings once it arrived in Australia. These photos show Buffalo B3119 once again, at different times in its career, in what are probably similar markings that were applied to the aircraft that crashed on Mount Stanley. In operational service in 1942, Dutch buffaloes are known to have been painted with a different national insignia, the Dutch flag, replacing the orange triangle. But it is not known whether that insignia was applied to the Mount Stanley aircraft prior to it being delivered to the US Army Air Forces. Those who witnessed the crash stated that the aircraft seemed to have been experiencing engine trouble prior to it crashing. One question we wanted to answer was whether this was actually the case, or if perhaps the different engine noises heard were due to, say, the Doppler effect as the aircraft first approached then flew away, hidden by the clouds at the time, or perhaps the sound echoing through the valley. While it was improbable it would be able to determine this from the wreckage, Constable Miller specifically mentioned the engine being at the site, so we wanted to keep this in mind while conducting the rest of the project. Witnesses also stated that the aircraft caught fire after it crashed. We wanted to see what such burning may have done to the material evidence. Constable Miller stated that items had been destroyed by fire, but made no mention of a fire continuing while he was on site. This is probably due to any fire being doused by the poor weather prior to Miller visiting the site. Artefacts from the site have been salvaged on at least 3 occasions. Some items are now located at the Burke Museum in Beechworth, the Gippsland Armed Forces Museum at the West Sale Airport, and, as briefly mentioned, at the Aviodrome in the Netherlands. Those artefacts now located in the Netherlands are believed to have been salvaged by a New Zealand-based collector, then sold on to the Aviodrome through a third party in the United States as part of a collection of buffalo parts, including artefacts salvaged from 2 other two IAAF buffalo wrecks in Western Australia. Contrary to what Rick Hanning had said about his research with the Aviodrome, while they have confirmed to me that they acquired a collection of buffalo parts from the US, they have been unable to confirm the identity of the site or sites from which these artefacts came. The removal of these artefacts from the site could potentially hinder any subsequent archaeological survey or investigation that was to be conducted at the wreck. So an effort was made to also try and record exactly what artefacts existed in such museums and private collections. On 1 July 2015, the 73rd anniversary of the Buffalo crash, I visited the Burke Museum in Beechworth and catalogued their assemblage of 11 artefacts reportedly from the Buffalo wreck. These included a damaged Brewster Aero Corporation data plate, a piece of tubular steel, some melted aluminium, not ammunition, and other aluminium components, some of which included what appeared to be original paint. The large artefact shown in the Border Mail's article on the previous slide was among the artefacts catalogued and is seen in the image on the right. Unfortunately, those at the Burke Museum were unable to advise of the location of the wreck on Mount Stanley. The specific location of the wreck was later discovered by chance when conducted further desk-based research about the crash. A geocache had been reportedly established at the wreck site and the latitude and longitude published online. When mapped, this location was indeed on the southern slope of Mount Stanley, as witnesses reported in 1942. On 23 November 2015, myself and one other visited the Mount Stanley Scenic Reserve in the hopes of finding the wreck. This image shows the view from the top of Mount Stanley that morning. Although we had the coordinates plotted in our GPS, it took some time to determine exactly which of the rough tracks would get us close to the site. The site was eventually located that afternoon on a steep slope with scatters of artefacts being identified amongst the trees, rocks, and ferns. This shows just one of the artifact scatters and the gradient of the slope on the right. Only one artefact related to the engine was identified during this site reconnaissance, though it would shed no light on any sort of engine trouble. The artefact on the left is shown with the same sort of piece in one of Tomorrow Aviation Museum's cutaway engines on the right. Thus, the reconnaissance survey was actually a success. We'd confirmed the location of the wreck on the southern slopes of Mount Stanley, photographed a number of artefacts surviving in situ, and mapped the best way to access the site in the future. The wreck is located inside the Mount Stanley Scenic Reserve at an altitude of approximately 750 metres, about 2 kilometres southwest of the peak of Mount Stanley. On 1 February 2019, I presented the initial historical research and the results of the reconnaissance survey at the Victorian Archaeology Colloquium held at the La Trobe University. This raised much interest in the site and allowed me to form a team consisting of myself and 3 other archaeologists to document the wreck. We created a GoFundMe campaign to pay for travel expenses and supplies on the day, ultimately raising approximately $700 to conduct an archaeological survey. On the morning of 16 March 2019, a group consisting of myself, archaeologist Megan Atchison, Talia Green and Leah Byrne, and accompanied by aviation journalist James Kitely, made our way to the site. Due to the limitations imposed by the terrain and the undergrowth, our methodology for recording the site involved identifying an artefact scatter, recording the scatter's position with a GPS, photographing the scatter and describing the number and type of artefacts found in each. We recorded 33 artefact scatters, located over a distance of approximately 50 metres up the hillside. We'd probably locate a lot more if we took a remote sensing device, such as a metal detector, but that's actually not permitted in that particular park. The wreck was confirmed as being that of a Brewster Buffalo through this diagnostic piece. There's an ammunition bay panel from the wing of the aircraft and matches those which were visible on the sole surviving Buffalo in Finland, shown on the right. Nothing to confirm the aircraft serial number was identified during the archaeological survey. A number of part numbers and inspection stamps were, however, recorded, though these will not shed any light on the aircraft's individual identity. They may, however, be important for documenting components of what is actually a rare aircraft. Note the stylized B stamps in these 2 artifacts, presumably meaning Brewster. So to answer some of the questions that we asked about the Buffalo, while nothing was located at the wreck site itself to confirm the aircraft's identity during either the 2015 reconnaissance or the 2019 archaeological survey, one artefact held by the Burke Museum may shed some light on this. On the right is a representation of the damaged data plate held by the Burke Museum. Dutch researcher Peter Bohr has suggested that it might indicate that the aircraft was actually tail number 314 rather than 304 as previously documented. However, as he has also suggested, that some parts of each Buffalo may have been mixed between different examples when modifications were being applied. This would require some more research before confirming one way or another. In short, parts were taken apart and then put back together willy-nilly. Unfortunately, this artefact's context was lost when it was taken from the wreck site prior to being acquired by the Burke Museum. So we have no way of knowing what part of the aircraft it came from. While it does include a part number, no part catalogue of the Brewster Buffalo, particularly the model 33923 has yet been located. Artefacts were located at the site both during the 2015 reconnaissance survey and the 2019 archaeological survey, as well as in the collection of the Burke Museum that include the remains of original paint. We're still working to document this exactly and compare with existing documentation, and hope the results can be included in our final paper on the site. It is probable that artefacts exist with the remains of both the original factory markings as well as later US Army Air Forces markings. This includes different types of camouflage, as well as what appears to be silver paint and grey undersurface paint as used by the US Army Air Forces. As no major engine component was located, it was impossible to determine whether the aircraft was suffering any sort of engine trouble prior to its crashing. While this was a question thought improbable to answer from the start, it has raised the question about where the engine has ended up. It was located by those who first visited the crash site after the incident. Was it removed from the site by the military? Or was it salvaged post-war? Or has something else happened to it? We don't yet know. Small pieces of melted aluminium were located during the archaeological survey in 2019 and are included in the Burke Museum collection. This confirms that pieces of the wreck reached temperature above 660 degrees Celsius at some point, most probably in the moments immediately after the crash, confirming witness testimony that the aircraft caught fire. For those interested in reading more about this project, here is some of our output so far. This includes my paper that has been released on the initial historical research and site reconnaissance, a presentation made at the Heritage of the Air conference in Canberra, some of which has been replicated in this presentation, and a short article by James Kitely and I, which appeared in the last issue of Flight Path. We're still working on what will probably be our final paper covering this site, which we hope to have sent for peer review by the end of this year. So for this particular site, thanks to all who contributed, I've missed a slide there, apologies for that. Thanks to all who contributed to our GoFundMe campaign. The work that we conducted on the Buffalo would not have been possible without their support. Thanks also to those who took part in the archaeological survey and to the University of New England Archaeology Department, who provided some of the equipment we used to conduct the survey. Thanks also to Rick Hanning of the Gippsland Armed Forces Museum, to Linda Peacock of the Burke Museum, to Raymond Ostugo of the Aviation, and to Peter Bohr and Peter Dunn for their assistance with various aspects of this project. Is it worth we look at questions now, Peter, for the Buffalo, or should I continue?
Continue, I'd say.
Not a problem. So on to the second case study for this evening. My honours project looking at the archaeology of airfields used by schools of the Empire Air Training Scheme during the Second World War. This project was conducted through the University of New England under the supervision of Professor Martin Gibbs. The Empire Air Training Scheme, or EATS, which I'll refer to it in this presentation, was one of the largest defence training initiatives of World War II, which saw British and Commonwealth Air Force personnel being trained as aircrew at schools in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. The EATS was initially signed off between the delegates from Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand at Ottawa in December 1939, just 3 months after war had been declared. The idea was that these nations would be able to provide the large amounts of land and airspace required for training aircrew at home, with a regular influx of personnel and at sites which would not be vulnerable to enemy attack. Once established, the training process and equipment used was to be standardised, ensuring that aircrew had all received equal experience prior to flying operational missions, regardless of where they have trained. Training started in early 1940 and continued until 1945, with over 37,000 members of the Royal Australian Air Force being trained under that scheme. And this flowchart provides an overview of the process a new trainee would go through while training under the EATS in Australia. Based on their ability as determined by the initial training school at the top, an airman was mustered into the role of pilot, observer, or wireless air gunner. This would then determine what subsequent schools the airman attended, with pilots being trained at schools on the left of the flowchart over a period of 50 weeks, observers trained at schools in the centre over 36 weeks, and wireless air gunners also trained over a period of 36 weeks at the schools on the right and in the centre. My honours project included all schools in this flowchart that were based at airfields. The project did not include sites used by the operational training units, as these were established by the Air Force in question for their own purpose, external to the EATS process. It also did not include the central flying schools or other facilities for training instructors. So the question I wanted to answer, or the main question I wanted to answer, as the aircraft used by all nations in the EATS were described as the same, or at least very similar, and as the training process was essentially standardised, it was theorised that airfields used by schools of the EATS would have also been built in a standardised manner. The main aim of this project was to determine what level of standardisation, if any, existed between the nations of the EATS in regards to airfield design. Other questions were also asked regarding how each airfield evolved in post-war years, modern memorialisation, and each site's access to transportation infrastructure, such as railways. Those questions won't be answered in this presentation, but I'm more than happy to discuss them at a later point if anyone wants to contact me. The project was mainly a desk-based study that involved the investigation of both wartime and modern aerial imagery. Research was conducted at the Australian War Memorial and National Archives of Australia. Contact was made with the RAAF Museum, Office of Air Force History, the Air Force Museum of New Zealand, and Library and Archives Canada. While numerous historical volumes, including official histories and autobiographies, were also consulted. A catalogue of the training schools was first established, then the locations of each airfield was identified in the modern landscape using Google Earth, and the location details were subsequently recorded in a Microsoft Access database. Using the modern aerial imagery and Google Earth as a form of remote sensing, alongside World War II era photography, details regarding the overall layout of each airfield, as well as the type of structures and other features, were then recorded. Ultimately, 152 airfields were identified as being used by schools of the Empire Air Training Scheme, distributed around the world as shown on the left. This included 7 sites in the United States that were utilised by British flying training schools. These sites were chosen as a form of control if differences between the Commonwealth nations could not be determined. The locations of 7 airfields used by EATS schools in Australia, listed on the right, were also visited to ground truth the features identified in the aerial imagery. So, for example, Ballarat in Victoria, the image on the left, shows the Ballarat airfield with the approximate wartime boundary highlighted. On the right is the Sergeant's Mess, as it was in July 2018. For Narrandera, on the left, the wartime boundary of the Narrandera airfield is shown across modern aerial imagery. Note the area south of the main road where the camp was, which is now private property. On the right, the sole surviving Bellman hangar at Narrandera is pictured. At Point Cook, I photographed refurbished Bellman hangars shown on the right. This was of particular interest to me due to the fire hydrant or fire suppression system located between the two hangars, which I'd previously seen at another site, which will be coming up in the next couple of slides. The wartime airfield at Tamworth is now the industrial suburb of Taminda. Few structures from the wartime period survive. Streets have been named after a number of aircraft types, such as Lockheed Street, and a memorial cairn has been established to the training schools at one of the intersections. The former RAF station near Nquinty is now a private farm. At the site, it was possible to locate foundations of a number of former structures, including the Bellman hangars. Between two of these foundations, in the same location as at Point Cook, the remains of the fire hydrants were also identified, shown here on the right. Other features identified include the signal square, which is on the initial slide of this presentation, airport circle, and the swimming pool. While RAF Base Wagga itself was not accessed as part of this project, the surrounding environment was. Of particular interest to me for this project was the former railway running through the site. Shown on the right, the water tower located inside RAF Base Wagga can be seen in the background of that photo. During the project, three distinct types of airfields were identified. The first was an open field layout where there was no defined or sealed runway and aircraft landed at what was essentially a grass paddock, such as here in Nquinty, shown here. There were crossed runways where two or more defined runways intersected each other, such as in this 1943 aerial photo of Mascot. And the third was a runway triangle, where three or more defined runways were connected at the ends to form a triangle, and none of the runways actually intersected. So it turned out that the open field layout was predominantly used in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, or Southern Rhodesia at the time. While the runway triangle layout, not seen in any of these countries, was used on quite a wide scale in Canada. This suggests that there were similarities in airfield design within many of the countries that participated within the EATS and Commonwealth training programs. But unlike the standard or similar aircraft and syllabus applied, no standard airfield design was decided upon for the nations taking part in the EATS as a whole. These different designs and the technologies and structures employed at each may have been due to their location. In particular, each site's distance from the equator. As such, sites further from the equator, like those in Canada, would be more susceptible to snowfall. Sealed runways at these sites would be easier to drain than large open fields, while the structures, such as the lightweight design of a Bellman hangar, prominent at each site within Australia, would not be able to support the load of a heavy snowfall. So far, the main output from this project has been my honours thesis, the citation for which is shown here. Some aspects of this project have been incorporated into and then expanded on in my current PhD project. Thanks to my supervisor for this project, Martin Gibbs. The others listed here who help with various aspects of research or provided access to sites and or archival material. For me, my primary project at the moment is to continue working on my PhD project. Due to the current pandemic lockdown, this has meant that some of my upcoming field work has been delayed, while some academic conferences I was hoping to attend have also been postponed until next year. In regards to other aviation sites, there are at least 2 more aircraft wrecks I'm hoping to document in the near future, one by the end of this year. Further details about each will be made available at a later date. And for anyone that's been paying attention, there are the references during this presentation, but thank you to everyone.
Thanks, Daniel. That was very interesting. Would you like to take questions now?
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
My first question, Daniel, is about the Beechworth wreckage.
Yep.
I wish I'd known it was there. I was there last year. Went to some museums, but if I saw it, I probably dismissed it at the time. Did you figure out what part of the aircraft that came from? It's pretty hard when it's all crushed up like that, but I was thinking maybe wing.
The artifacts, we don't know exactly. Based on what's at the actual crash site and what's in the museum, we're thinking, well, there are definitely parts of, well, there were parts of engine, there are definitely parts of engine mount, and there are definitely parts of what looks to be part of wing. We haven't seen anything that's looks like the tail or anything like that. Now, whether those are the parts that have been sent off to Holland, I don't know. But yeah, I'd say that there was definitely parts of fuselage, probably forward fuselage, and parts of the wing in that collection.
I was thinking mainly of that major part which they showed originally. You showed originally hung up, and then you were investigating. I thought that might have been a bit of wing.
Yeah, that one I'm not 100% on just yet. Probably wing, yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, in the quiet then, my father was an EATS navigator. I started in Cuda.
Yep.
And wound up at Evans Head, 1 bags. And that was all on Ansons and battles.
Mm-hmm.
You might like the comment he made in the battle. You lie down in a little channel underneath the aircraft, in the bottom of the fuselage, and it takes all of the engine fumes straight into it when you're trying to do a bomb aiming exercise. And so it was a very sick-making aeroplane. He then proceeded to Summerside in Canada. Is that one of the places you're familiar with?
It's one of the ones that I did study, yes.
It's in PEI, I believe, up in northern Canada. Very cold, lots of snow. Topped that course, and so wound up being, instead of a dead in Bomber Command, he went to Nassau, 111 OTU, and trained on Mitchells and Liberators.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And went to Ceylon and flew out of Canker Centuri and Sigiriya, which is their famous rock in the middle of the island, and chased submarines across the Indian Ocean. And they all survived. The crew survived. In fact, the pilot eventually became Mountbatten's personal pilot. That's just an example of EATSing for somebody. Mostly we look at pilots, but he was an AV.
Yeah. Now, the main reason that I chose looking at the EATS was my grandfather's cousin enlisted and trained initially on Tiger Moths as a pilot at Parafield. And then went to Canada late in the war where was he? Just south of Alberta. I can't think of the name off the top of my head. Where he flew Oxford. And then he returned to the Pacific, not to Bomber Command or anything, or returned to Australia, sorry, and then flew the aircraft or the Ansons that gunners were using at Ballarat and ended the war on Bougainville with, I think it was number 39 OBU. So that was my kind of reason for looking at EATS sites.
And what I just said was the reason for my interest.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Daniel, researchers like yourself, how much interest is there in looking at Horn Island and all the activities that took place there during World War II? I was absolutely fascinated in a recent visit as to how much scope there is for research and things like that.
Yeah, one archaeologist, he presented details on that in a conference last year on, I think, the anti-aircraft gun set. It's definitely one of the sites that I'm covering within my PhD project. What others are interested in, sorry, I can't say, but yeah, there definitely is interest of at least a few of us. So.
Daniel, can I ask you, I noticed amongst the references that you mentioned here,
Sure.
I don't see any reference to some work that I believe Lindsay Peat did. Lindsay was Western Australian, who's since died. And I remember that he did quite some work on Cunderdin, and I believe his interest spread beyond Cunderdin.
Yeah.
Where does his stuff sit with your knowledge?
I'll put it this way. I can't say that I've heard of his work off the top of my head, at least. I'm literally making a note of it now, and I'll look it up. If it's with Cunderdin, it would have definitely been involved, or would have been something I would have appreciated during my honours project, at least. But yeah, I'll put it this way. I hadn't heard of it, and I will definitely look into that.
How much of his stuff exists today, I can't say, because I do know his library was sold off by the family, because I saw it turn up in second-hand bookshops.
You say that he published books or something?
No, his library.
Oh, okay, yep.
So how much of his research work is left? Who knows?
No, I've made a note of it, and I'll definitely look into that next couple of days.
Daniel, just on the matter of Lindsay's stuff, I've got a recollection that he did some thesis work, probably Western Australian University would be worth looking at.
No worries. I'll look at that angle as well. Thank you.
Daniel, can I just make a quick comment?
Sure.
You mentioned Raymond Ustigo from Aviodrome.
Yep.
You may or may not know, and probably do know, that he was a survivor of the crash of the Convair in South Africa just a few years ago.
I was not aware of that.
And in addition to that, he made a trip to Australia earlier this year, but rushed back in order to get back to Holland before the borders closed with coronavirus.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Well, yeah, it's definitely unfortunate that he couldn't get out here. Well, couldn't stay out here. Yeah, if I'd known, I would have loved to have met the guy. We'd spoken a couple of times via email. But yeah, I hadn't spoken to him or hadn't contacted him in at least a couple of years. So, but no, thank you for that.
Daniel?
Yeah.
It's Graham Aspinall from Townsville in North Queensland.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, say hello to Martin Gibbs for me the next time you contact with him. He used to be at James Cook University in the Archaeology department. So I worked there with Martin. Yeah, he's a very, very decent bloke. I really enjoyed working with him. So say hello to him for me next time.
Will do. I'll probably be sending him an email tomorrow. I'm now based in Armidale, which is where he is. We'll be chatting the next couple of days at least. I'll definitely say hi for you.
Okay, thanks, Daniel.
No worries.
Gentlemen,
Any more
before I finish
questions?
calling, I've got Dave Prosser on the telephone. He's listening and watching from Melbourne, but he has a device where he can't speak or give you a picture. So he's on the phone. I'm going to let him speak now. He's got something to add to the Brewster buffalo story. Go ahead, Dave.
Daniel, hi. I'm able to see you guys, but not be able to talk on my PC, so I'm using the mobile via Archaeology. And just in relation to Brewster buffalo, it has been discovered at least twice in years gone by. We're talking about probably 20 years back and publicised in the paper, because at the time it was misidentified as being a Orion aircraft. And apparently they misidentified the serial A50-1 or similar, and thought that was in fact Orion, not the buffalo. Today, while they were trying to identify exactly what it was, until eventually it turned out to be the buffalo rather than Orion. And the second thing was the publicity at the time, and I'm sure there were two so-called discoveries of the machine. There was some discussion that the aircraft engine had in fact been recovered and taken away by parties unknown to locations unknown. So that could explain why you couldn't find it down the hill of where the actual accident site that you discovered there. So it has been found in the past and it's been misidentified, but nothing in the references or from your discussion tonight, which was very, very good, thank you. But there was no mention of that sort of discovery and publicity in the papers 20 years ago, maybe even as far as back as 30 years ago. But I'm sure it's been publicised at least twice that aircraft wreck found. At one stage it said they believed it was Orion, and then later identified correctly as buffalo. And then there was a second discovery maybe 10 years after that. So add that to your catalogue of knowledge. That's all the details I've got at the time, but I do recall it turning up in some sort of enthusiast newsletter around the time that it was discovered here. That's it.
Thanks for that. I'll put it this way: it was hard to understand exactly what was coming through, but my understanding, what was being discussed, was that Orion, R-Y-A-N, not an O-R-I-O-N, aircraft was lost in that area, or that's what they were searching for. Was that correct?
If you can hear me there, Daniel, Orion was not crashed in that area, but apparently the material on the fuselage was indistinct, and it was misidentified as Orion rather than being the buffalo. So there must have been, at some stage or rather, the serial of A51 dash was on the fuselage identified, but probably burnt, lost or whatever, in such a way that it was thought to be an Orion train or Orion monoplane rather than the buffalo. So,
Okay.
Put that in your knowledge of things to follow up, but it has certainly been written up in the past in some enthusiast journal or other, maybe myself in fact, and we're looking at a period of maybe 20, maybe 30 years back.
Okay. Now, to be honest, that's the first I've heard of Orion either being located in the area or being confused, possibly in the area. I know that in an article written for Flight Path 20 or more years ago, the wreck was discussed. The original article in Flight Path was about Beaufort's, specifically about A9228, which was lost on Mount Tawonga, not far from there, near Eskdale. And it mentioned or alluded to an unknown wreck on Mount Stanley. But basically the year or two after that, everything that I've seen was regarding the buffalo. And yeah, like I say, in the discussion today, the parts that I saw, at least on site, looked, confirmed basically the ammunition bay cover as the type that was also on the buffalo in Finland, while the pieces held by the Beechworth Museum definitely refer to Brewster. So the parts that I've seen are definitely buffalo. Yeah.
Excuse me there, Daniel. I have no doubt at all that you certainly correct to identify the aircraft, but the persons who discovered or rediscovered the parts, as I said, 20, maybe 30 years back, I'm sure that they misidentified it as a Orion, and for a few days there was a bit of a mystery there until it was correctly identified. Give me time, I might be able to dig out something for your record.
Yeah, no, cheers. No, that'd be great.
Daniel, the only Ryan I've got on my list of crashes is one near West Sale. There's a few others out in the sea, but it's one near
I
West
think
Sale.
there was one up near Bankstown or something like that with one of the Spitfire squadrons, maybe, but very few anyway that I know of.
Let me check New South Wales. I was just looking in Victoria. None. Oh, I've got none in New South Wales. So yeah, but my list is by no means complete. Okay, folks. Any other questions?
Not a question, Daniel, but I'd certainly like to thank you for your deliveries tonight. I'm going to have to disappear now, but thanks to all.
No, thank you, Roger.
All right.
Okay, I'll stop the live stream now.